think it's an easy question to answer. If you're free or not. How would you respond to that question? Are you free? Who's free? How do we define freedom, right? So certainly it's a question you could ask 100 people what freedom means, and most likely we'll get 100 different answers on the definition of freedom. Sheila, your phone, your device again is making noises. Got to keep it muted. Thank you. So how do you define it? Now, you're welcome to share your answer if you would like, or if you prefer, we can have this discussion now, and I could share with you some of my perspective on freedom. That's what I want to do today, is take a closer look at the concept of freedom. What does it mean, at least from a Torah perspective? And even that, just what I prepare in a shir is not going to give you the full Torah perspective on freedom. So we're going to do our best here to discuss freedom from a Torah perspective, but I would love to hear your ideas as well, and hopefully we get a deeper pragmatic, relevant interpretation of freedom in the context of Pesach, and of course its relevance to our lives here today, which is, after all, what we want to talk about. So Pesach is just 2 weeks away, 2 weeks from this Saturday night. And we have to get ready. We have to start. In fact, I'm hoping starting next week, I'm going to be getting a lot more practical. This week, we're still in the theory, but we want to get more practical into the rituals and the customs and how do we do it. And we talked yesterday about drinking the 4 glasses of wine and why 4 and why 3 matzahs. And we could talk about the maror, the bitter herbs, and all the various songs. Maybe we could do samples of those when we do our model Seder and talk about some of those. Don't forget the Shulchan Aruch, the delicious Pesach meal, right? The Pesach Seder allows us to experience, there's so much to experience within the Pesach Seder, right? And Jews across the world, as Pesach comes, I think, especially this year, which was a particularly difficult year for everyone, starting, just about a year ago is when lockdown happened, right? So we're going to bask in that freedom of movement this year. We get to go outside. Remember what last year was like? We sort of locked ourselves in our homes for a month. It was supposed to be only 3 weeks, and then it just kept getting extended. And we're looking forward to that. But perhaps we Jews have historically felt something about Pesach more so than other holidays. And that could be a separate debate, which is the most popular of Jewish holidays. What do you think it is? I'm sure if we go around, different people have different answers. What you enjoy. Some people think Hanukkah is the most popular Jewish holiday. What is it about Pesach that a lot of people feel connected and want to celebrate Pesach somewhere or other every year? And the Torah's terminology for it is Man Cherisenu, the season of our freedom. Because I think we all could resonate and connect with the idea, the concept of freedom, liberty. It's something that that really resonates with all of us. And throughout our history, the Jewish people, we have struggled for our freedom, for religious freedom, to just be Jewish, to be able to practice our Judaism. It's something that, unfortunately, we know we couldn't take for granted all of these years. This was something that, sadly, we were oppressed throughout our history in many places where Jewish people lived. So therefore, we know that freedom is something that's very important to us, and we're not taking it for granted. It's something that we certainly going to celebrate, the freedom that we have, freedom to exist, the basic liberties of being Jewish, of being who we are. Oftentimes, Jews were persecuted not even for being religious. In the Third Reich, Hitler, Yamach Shemo, didn't matter. One wasn't even considered halachically Jewish. To him, the Jewish race was a problem. Just the fact that one was affiliated with Judaism. So it's certainly the idea of freedom resonates and connects with us. And I could say here, if we live in South Africa, I think the idea of freedom is one that connects with many people in this country. So whoever's watching, usually sometimes I like to make a little bit of what happened here? My computer just died. Ladies and gents, it looks like my presentation just disappeared. Okay, give it a couple of minutes and I'll try to I'll try to get that presentation back up there for you. I apologize about that. I don't know, you still seem to be able to see it. I can't see the presentation. It seems to be gone from my computer. Okay, so as soon as my second device restarts, I'll try to put the presentation back up for you. But talking about freedom, let's discuss this. It's more difficult for us as Jews to relate to Pesach in some ways because, thanks to God, we're practically living the dream today. Today we're free. We have more freedom to practice Judaism than we've had in thousands of years. So we are grateful for that. But we should never forget or take for granted that freedom which we have. And in fact, there's a famous Mishnah that we read when it comes to Pesach. The whole Dovador in every generation, Chayav Adam Liras as Atzma, a person is obligated to see themselves, Ki'ilu hu yatsa mimitzrayim, as if you left Egypt. Which is why perhaps every single day in our prayers, we recall our exodus from Egypt. right? We recall our slavery. And we are grateful that God emancipated us way back then. In fact, this year is 3,333 years since the liberation from our slavery in Egypt. Now, if you think about it in a legal context, the simple meaning of this statement that in every generation we have to recall, actually, if you want to translate it more literally, I'm thinking, you have to see yourself as if you yourself came out of Egypt. So we're supposed to reenact that experience at the Pesach Seder. That's what we're meant to do. To reenact it, to experience it. It's not just a commemoration. As we know, nothing in Judaism is just a commemoration. In Judaism, everything has a reason, a purpose, and there is a connection to us personally. So if you read the words of Rambam that I have here, Rambam says, what does it mean in every generation? If I'm not a slave in Egypt, how am I supposed to see myself experiencing freedom from Egypt if I was never in that country in my life? So he says, on this night, a person has to eat and drink while he is reclining in the manner of free people. Once upon a time, only free people were able to recline and relax. The rest of, if you were a slave, you couldn't just relax and enjoy life the way free people were to. Just a minute, ladies and gents. Let me try to get the PowerPoint back up here. I apologize that I got issues with my computers. There's always got to be something, right? So we just have to accept it as it is. So let me quickly read Rambam to you while the computer restarts. Rambam says, each and every person, men and women equally, has to drink the 4 cups on the Seder night, and no less than 4 cups. So yesterday, Lester asked the question. I don't see Lester on today. But yesterday, Lester asked the question, can you drink more? Well, as long as it's noticeable, as long as you keep it somehow distinct that those 4 cups are the 4 cups you're saying the blessing on, and your additional cups are separate, they are something else, then I think there's no problem with that. But, that's specifically if you're able to make that distinction between the 4 cups of wine for the Seder versus the wine that you're liking to drink with your dinner, right? Because that's different. And Rambam says even a poor person who's sustained by charity. In fact, it's not Rambam. I was reading it in the Mishnah yesterday. If you study the current Daf Yomi, the daily page of the Talmud, it's currently talking about that concept. It's very interesting that the Daf Yomi cycle is presently studying the laws of Pesach. So it's very perfect. It's perfect timing and appropriate to be studying that this time of the year. But the point I'm making is that Rambam is telling us, and the Mishnah is telling us, and the Talmud is telling us, even a poor person has to experience and study and celebrate Pesach in the best way possible. That means even somebody who's getting their food provided by, the Talmud says, by the kupa, by the communal organization. Thank God in our community we have such organizations. And the truth is, most likely any Jewish community anywhere in the world, there are organizations that will assist people. I'm always reminded of the story. I love this story. It's a story of Rabbi Chaim Soloveitchik, the Brisker Rav, that once somebody came to him to ask him if he can use, instead of wine for his Pesach meal, if he could use milk. So the rabbi then made his way to his collection, the rabbi's discretionary fund, and the rabbi gave him a large amount of cash for his contribution. The Rebbitzin who was watching, or someone else who observed this, asked the rabbi, the guy just said he can't afford wine, right? He asked you if you could have milk. I think I botched up the story. The rabbi asked this man, are you allergic to wine? That was his question. Are you allergic to wine? Because if you're allergic to wine, then perhaps he's thinking that milk could be an alternative for the Seder. And the response was, no, I'm not. He's not allergic to wine. He just can't afford the wine. And if he can't afford the wine, so the rabbi said, if that's the case, the rabbi gave him a large amount of money. And the person who was observing this, whether it was the wife, whether it was the Rebbitzin or somebody else, commented to the rabbi after this person left, they only said that they can't afford he said he can't afford wine. You gave him a lot more money than he needs for just wine. And the rabbi's response was, well, if he can't afford wine, chances are he wasn't considering to have milk with meat, right? So if he wasn't going to have milk with meat, chances are he couldn't afford other staples for his Seder either. And who knows about clothing for his family, etc., right? So that being the case, I had to, I made him an offer. I gave him enough that he's able to take care of his personal needs. Give me a second, ladies and gents. There's something wrong here. I just got to figure out where our PowerPoint went. Okay, there it is. All right, now we just got to log back in with our PowerPoint. Give it a minute. And I think I can multitask, but I'm not that talented. Anyways, while my computer's trying to get the Zoom going, I'll continue my thoughts. So that's one aspect, and that's discussed in the Talmud, the importance of everyone celebrating the Pesach Seder. But on a deeper, more personal level, if you want to analyze this Mishnah, that in every generation, and in fact, it's one of the 12 verses that the Rebbe encouraged kids to study. There are 12 Torah passages that the Rebbe encouraged children to study, and this is one of them. In every generation, you have to see yourself as if you are experiencing the exodus from Egypt, as if you personally are being emancipated from slavery. So we have to see it as a personal experience, not just in a, not just in a, how would you call it? Not just symbolically, not just commemoratively, but as if you yourself are experiencing this exodus. Now, how are you going to experience the exodus if you were never there, right? So it leads to the obvious question: if we are no longer in slavery, thank God, and for the most part, in most of the world today, that doesn't exist. Of course, we have to be cognizant and aware of those places where there are situations that people are being oppressed. But other than that, if we're not slaves, and hopefully that concept and oppression is no longer existing elsewhere, then how are we supposed to personally experience it? Like I said, I've never been to Egypt. The only one in this group who I think has ever been to Egypt is Yoav. Yoav, you want to wave your hand to us? For those who are present to see you. Yoav has been to Egypt. Yoav was born in Egypt. Right, Yoav? You have your video closed still. We would love to see you. Yoav is the only one I could see here that I know of. It could be that some others in this group have also been to Egypt. Who knows? Maybe you went on a tour. But Yoav was born and bred there. So considering that, and on the flip side, for those Jews who in the past, or even unfortunately, maybe still today, it does exist, that people find themselves oppressed, in living in certain regimes or tightly controlled environments. How can they feel that message of freedom of Pesach if they themselves are not in a free position? Now you might say, well, the same. This could apply to somebody who's perhaps confined to illness, or in jail, or other situations. Right? There are situations where people find themselves that you would say they're not really free. This is a question that's an age-old question. It's already discussed in the Talmud. We live, and if we think of today where we're living in freedom, then certainly we must be talking about our own personal freedom inside. You may have seen a campaign that Chabad has been promoting lately about, are you a prisoner to your cell phone? You locked in your cell. In fact, Rabbi Masinta came up with this idea of selling these cell phone cages to help us overcome, to help us break free from our personal constraints and limitations. The Maharal asked this question, actually. He lived in Prague under very oppressive, difficult times. You know, this history created the Golem to fight for the community there. So he asked, aren't we now still enslaved by other regimes? That was the question of the Maharal of Prague. And I think it's a question we can relate to. If we're not oppressed, then how are we supposed to, then what's its message to us? And if one is living under oppression, then how are they supposed to experience the message of Pesach freedom? Okay, so my great-grandparents were emancipated, but what about me today? So perhaps for us, re-experiencing the Exodus in a physical sense might seem far-fetched, and maybe that's not what the Mishnah is telling us. But in an internal sense, leaving Egypt has a deep and profound relevance to each of our lives, which we discussed many times. The very word Egypt in Hebrew, Mitzrayim, is the same thing. Meitzarim means constraints, limitations. So therefore, Egypt is not only a geographical location, to paraphrase the words of Dale Carnegie. The Nile is not just a river in Egypt, and Egypt is not just a country in the Middle East. It's a state of mind. If I have that slave mentality, I'm stuck in Egypt. And probably every human being has things that they have, habits or addictions or situations that they need to break free from. Everyone can relate to that idea. Pesach is the holiday of freedom. It's about much more than our ancestors' freedom from enslavement in Egypt 3,333 years ago. It's also about each of us, you and me, reaching a state of freedom within ourselves today. This is what it's about. Joy, do you have a question? I see you're unmuted. If you don't mind, if you have a question, feel free. Otherwise, if you could just keep yourself muted. So the point is that what is the relevance to us today? This is what we're trying to celebrate and to experience on Pesach, freedom. How could we experience freedom in our lives today? Whatever word you want to use, freedom, liberty, right? Independence. This is something in this country people strived for, and there's still a disproportionate amount of inequality here in South Africa, still today, 27 years after the fall of apartheid. It still exists. So maybe if we could look at the Jewish perspective of freedom, maybe we could glean some ideas that will help us appreciate how inner freedom could bring about really true outer freedom to the world. So that in mind, let's discuss how to leave our personal Egypts. What can we do to fulfill the meaning of this Mishnah, this passage in the Talmud that says every generation we have to come out of Egypt? What does that mean to each of us today? How are we breaking free from our Egypts? Yes, physically throughout history, there were people who were oftentimes experiencing persecution and troubles. But now today we're going to talk about personal liberation. In fact, where I come from, the expression is part of the inalienable rights that every human being has, is the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So what is freedom? Because it seems to be very central to very central to society today, to the core beliefs. In fact, you think about today, there is a hearing, a jury on the murder of George Floyd. Criminal or not, regardless of what he committed, his freedom is taken away. Oftentimes, police brutality gets out of hand. And thank God we live today in a democratic society where such behaviors can be dealt with in a democratic, in a proper way. And that's very important to all human beings. The idea that we could express our freedom. For many people, the simplest and most straightforward meaning of freedom is, let me do what I want, when I want, where I want. Okay, that's perhaps one idea, one understanding of freedom. But what is that really freedom? You know, we're talking about the definition of freedom and, you know, the absence of control, of oppression, of others being in control of us, that power, persecution. In other words, we're defining freedom from a very negative perspective. Not being subject to the will of someone else. That's the idea of freedom from. And that's what that was the first half of the experience that we Jews had when God liberated us from Egypt. And perhaps you could say that in 1994, or maybe a little bit before that, what Madiba fought for in this country was that freedom from oppression. But is that freedom? That's what I ask you. If we are to truly define freedom, then we have to take into account that freedom really has two parts. One part that certainly I think has been achieved, that's the negative freedom, the freedom from oppression. But there's also a positive freedom, and that's something no one else can do for you but you to do for yourself. As I said yesterday, God took us out of Egypt, but it was up to us to take Egypt out of ourselves. That's the 49-day process from Pesach to Shavuos, where we work on our personal refinement. That's freedom too. That's where we got the Torah at Mount Sinai. That was a whole new level of freedom, which we're going to try to discuss and see how we can apply to ourselves. Because this is, I think, the idea that we want to develop. Very famous Jewish philosopher named Isaiah Berlin, who was actually a direct descendant of the Alter Rebbe. And Isaiah Berlin famously analyzed the differences between negative liberty and positive liberty. So you have the idea, on the one hand, is freedom from, that's the negative liberty, but you also have the freedom to do what you want, your choice of freedom. This essay is called Two Concepts of Liberty. Negative liberty is defined as the absence of restraint on your actions. And that's enshrined in such concepts, you think of the basic human and civil rights. Negative freedom is only actually a prerequisite to positive freedom. Because without negative freedom, you can never experience that positive freedom. But positive freedom is the ideal, where you can pursue your goals, your desires, and do that which you want, with nobody controlling, with no one saying only certain colored people could go here and only that. You can't achieve the personal freedom to do that which you want without the first freedom from the outside oppressive forces. So this, of course, is a very basic right, human right. But the Torah expressed the concept of negative and positive freedom at the story of our exodus from Egypt. And we discuss it each year at our Pesach Seder. It's a central theme of the Pesach Seder celebrations. Our freedom from bondage from Egypt was only that half, the negative half. Only once we were free from Pharaoh's rule, from the taskmasters burdening us with building their pyramids and whatever else, did we achieve from that freedom that the purpose of freedom, that we could have the freedom to. Something I discussed with you a few weeks ago. And in fact, tomorrow marks 29 years since the stroke that the Rabbi had in 1992, and the last talk that he gave, the last discourse, in which he discussed this idea that Jews of Russia, it was Va'ata Tetzava, he spoke about the concept that here, when they were being oppressed in Russia, many of them fought for the religious rights. Yet when they were liberated, glasnost, what happened? They forgot about their freedom of religion. So they fought for their freedom of religion, and then they all of a sudden went for freedom from religion. It was an irony that really bothered him very much. The crucial step of recognizing our freedom, that true inner freedom, was that whole journey in the desert that the Jewish people experienced. That journey was their freedom too. They were going to Mount Sinai, and there they underwent a very necessary transition from that negative form of freedom to the positive form of freedom. When they reached Mount Sinai, the Torah, that's when they discovered the purpose of their freedom. They became free. Yes, at the beginning was a negative freedom from oppression, from the Egyptian taskmasters, and then they had the positive freedom that they had the Torah. It was a choice. So while, yes, then it was initiated by the Exodus, it could only be fully realized and fully completed at Mount Sinai when they accepted the Torah that gave them direction, meaning, purpose in life. How does that apply to each of us in our lives? How do you apply this idea of freedom for yourself? Just a second. I want to use this computer. If you want to take this, just let me just see. Well, I'm not. I using it. Use it. Okay. Sorry, ladies and gentlemen. Hope this works. Just a second. We could do. Just pull out the mouse.
Oh, Father, I didn't do this.
Okay. Sorry. No, make a mess. Forget it.
Okay, you keep it.
Okay. Sorry, guys. Okay, so I guess I could pose the question to you like this. Do you believe that you possess both negative and positive freedoms? Do you think you have both aspects of freedom within yourself? Now, I would think that we certainly, I think in today's society, have that negative freedom. Nobody's really oppressing us, right? So then we have the ability to pursue positive freedom. And thank God, we live in a country that gives us our rights. Think about, yes, there's crime, and yes, there's problems, and yes, there's trouble. Put that all aside. That's not the government per se. Even if you say there's corruption in government, still we have the freedom from the will of others, okay? Obviously, every government has its shortcomings, but we're given the opportunity to choose our path in life. I don't see anybody interfering with that. But let's think about these freedoms on a deeper level and see if we really have that in our own personal everyday lives. One of the ways I thought I would do that with you, and I'm going to pause the screen for a minute. I'm going to share with you a quick video of a fellow named Howard Hughes. Anyone familiar with Howard Hughes? Let's just find the video. One second, ladies and gentlemen. And so let me first put on the video. Howard Hughes. I thought I had it on here, but my apologies. It disappeared. So give me a second. I'm going to share the screen with you. curious life of Howard Hughes. Okay, I'm going to put this video on. It's just a 3-minute video, and then we'll talk about him and his life right after.
Howard Hughes, famous flyer and sportsman, was dragged out of this wreckage of an experimental plane he was testing.
He was seriously injured. After ripping the corner from 2 homes in Beverly Hills, California, the plane finally plunged into this house. The force of the impact virtually wrecked the building and caused the plane to catch fire. The flyer said that the accident was due to motor failure shortly after his takeoff. He failed to make a crash landing on a golf course. Dennis O'Keefe, film actor, inspects damage done the home of Lieutenant Colonel Myers, chief interpreter at the Nuremberg war trials. America's aviation trailblazers willingly pay the price in man's conquest of the air.
Okay, I'm just going to end that there. Anyone familiar with Howard Hughes? So he was a very famous and wealthy person, and I think he had everything going for him, right? He was known for being one of the wealthiest people in his time, but also became a recluse. Although he was the son of a very successful oil drill tool manufacturer, inherited the family business, used some of his fortune to finance films. He developed a passion for flying, founded his own aircraft company in the early 1930s. He did a lot, became very, very wealthy. But yet, after that video that you just saw, where he crashed his plane, he started to retreat from the world. And in the 1960s, he lived on the top floor of a hotel in Las Vegas. That's where he did all his business, from that hotel suite. Few people ever saw him, which led to a lot of public speculation and rumors about his activities. And it was thought that he had some kind of OCD, he had a drug problem. And he eventually left Las Vegas, began living abroad. It's quite peculiar, the story of such a fabulously wealthy guy, and yet how his life ended in such a tragic way. Now you would think such a rich guy like him, is he free? He has all the money in the world, do whatever he wants with it. And did that give him the freedom to be free, or was he always concerned and skeptical, suspicious of people who are going to take his money? And the truth is, I'm plagiarizing this idea from a talk of the Rabbi. He spoke about Howard Hughes. And the Rebbe's words, which I want to read to you very briefly, he says, to truly experience freedom as the Torah prescribes, the first thing to know is that it's up to you to be free. A person has to decide internally that they want to be free. You have to make that choice. We read it in the Torah itself. God says, I give you choices in life. Choose life. So he may have had $2 billion, which was a lot of money back then. Still a lot of money even today, but just imagine what the value of that would be in today's economy. And yet, he still couldn't live. He was constantly concerned who's coming to steal from him, who's taking, what do people want from him? So the sad story of Howard Hughes as an example is a real reminder that riches, having the money to buy whatever you want, doesn't necessarily grant liberty. It's not necessarily freedom just because you have money. Sometimes with all that money could come more woes, more troubles, more worries. So now, of course, if you ask me, I wouldn't mind, and I'm sure most people wouldn't mind having anything close to the amount of money that Howard Hughes had. But we have to ask ourselves these questions and maybe look in the proverbial mirror. Since we woke up this morning, How many of our decisions have been dictated by what we truly desire, by what I really want deep down? How much of it has been dictated by others, by society, by the commercials we see on TV? So it's not always about having the money. Maybe there's that pressure out there, societal pressure, peer pressure. Can we really claim to be free if we're constantly feeling that we have to fulfill the wills of others? How often do we unthinkingly enslave ourselves by letting ourselves become boxed in by society's expectations of us, as opposed to making choices based on what we truly want? So, in other words, though we tend to define freedom as the ability to make our own choices, perhaps, in fact, what we think is freedom is simply the ability to choose our own masters rather than letting them choose us. Just some food for thought. So these are the types of questions we have to think of today. The difference between positive and negative freedom versus do we want the things that we really want, or is it something that society is imposing upon us? Very often we exercise our freedom by looking around us to see what other people are doing, right? Think of fashion, think of technology, think of the definitions of success. All that, is it my choice, or am I being influenced by others around us? And I can't believe how time's just flown by so quickly today. But the point we want to get at is it possible to be free in the purest sense, to escape that conformity and exercise our own will? Is it possible to be freed from the bondage of our own lusts and passions or societal pressure? Can a person have all that money and still be the master of their own will and destiny? To be free from whatever bondage, whatever constraints, whatever habits and addictions and everything else. And according to Judaism, the Torah's perspective, true freedom is absolutely within everyone's reach. That is something that is a message conveyed by the matzah. Think of the matzah. The matzah is the quintessential Pesach food. Now, yesterday we talked about the matzah as being bread of affliction. Today we could talk about it being bread of freedom. It's the food that the Jews ate when they left Egypt. But let me read the verse to you quickly that describes our exodus, our departure from Egypt. What is it? The Torah says, do not eat chametz on Pesach. Instead, 7 days you should eat matzah, the bread of poverty, of affliction, because you left Egypt in a hurry. So on the one hand, the Torah is calling the bread of poverty, which we discussed. But at the same time, the Torah gives us the mitzvah of eating matzah because you left in a haste from Egypt. What does that tell us? That the matzah is also the bread of freedom. So one second. Yesterday we said it's bread of poverty. Today we're saying it's bread of freedom. That sounds like quite a contradiction, no? Which one is it? Now, fascinatingly, Nachmanides, he talks about this, about both concepts, and tells us that on the one hand, matzah is the bread of the poor, okay, lechem oni. And one reason we eat matzah is to remind us of our slavery in Egypt, when the Egyptians fed the Jews matzah as slaves. That was the food they gave them. But at the same time, b'chipazon, you left Egypt in a hurry, so it's also the bread of freedom. It has both aspects to it. But it's the bread of poverty, and it's also the bread of freedom. Both concepts are alluded to, are expressed, are okay. The point is that, as Nachmanides puts it, that the Jews ate the matzah both in Egypt and they ate it when they left Egypt. So both ideas are being illustrated, demonstrated by eating the matzah. Now, obviously, by us eating it today, it's not just symbolic. It's not just eating the same food our ancestors left, but there is a relevance, a message to us as well. So for this, I'm going to share with you a little insight from the Maharal, who says we see the significance of matzah in its simplicity. Think of matzah, very simple food, just bare minimum ingredients of bread, flour and water, that's it. Poverty represents stripping our identity to its core, to who am I, to my essential self. And that is freedom too. That is freedom, realizing I could be who I want to be. So the other type of matzah would be the one that's called matzah ashira. What's matzah ashira? That's matzah that has more ingredients. Instead of water, they use juice or eggs. That's called matzah ashira. Let me quickly read to you the words of the Maharal and then try to analyze and explain it. He says as follows: matzah is the bread of poverty, as opposed to matzah ashira, which is enriched, has juice and eggs. Why is it called ashira, which means really rich? Because when matzah is prepared with oil or honey or eggs or juice, the quality of the dough is enhanced and enriched. So a poor person has no money or possessions. Right? All they have is themselves. All they have is their body. Similarly, matzah only consists of the pure dough, flour and water. And that's why it's called bread of poverty. But Maharal says, you wonder, what's the relationship between poverty and freedom? Are they not contradictory experiences? In truth, he says they're not contradictory. Poverty represents redemption, because redemption means freedom from all external elements. So in that sense, that which is enriched and embellished with other materials is not a model for redemption. I'm still reading you the words of Rambam. He says, that which is poor, that which is unadorned by any foreign elements, no juice and eggs and oil and honey and other ingredients, that is being true to itself. So he says, matzah doesn't symbolize the experience of being free per se. Yes, you could say in the story, it's the bread they ate when they left. But matzah also symbolizes the food that they ate as slaves. Matzah epitomizes the essential process of redemption, the shift away from dependence on outside intervention, the shift towards personal independence from all external elements. So he's telling us poverty symbolizes the basic minimum of human existence, where all you have is yourself. Matzah is called bread of poverty because... All right, does somebody have a question? No, Sheila, your device is unmuted. Thanks.
Man, I don't do anything. I'm nowhere near.
Don't worry, just keep it muted, that's all. Unless you have a question. If you have a question, feel free to ask. But for some reason, your device got unmuted. Maybe you pushed the button. So the point is that matzah, having those bare minimum ingredients, it's teaching us that to be enslaved in a spiritual sense is to be controlled by forces that are outside of our essential being. Like the matzah that's made of other ingredients. Attachments can take many forms. Our insecurities, maybe the expectations of others. We talked about peer pressure, our dependence on material things, on gadgets to make us happy, on blings, whatever it might be. Maybe other things, fears, insecurities, past baggage that we hold on to. There's so much that one can hold on to, other things that we use to define ourselves. That is Egypt. And although, when we strip ourselves of all those things, when we just connect to our core identity, then we're truly free. We're not worried, we're not hindered, we're not constrained by those externalities. So yes, of course, poverty is not a good thing. We're not saying poverty is a good thing, but there's an element to it. You obviously need possessions and things to live and to get on in this world. But spiritually and psychologically, we want to strip away everything that hinders us from being true to who we are. The point is not that we should not have physical possessions. That's not what we're advocating. But rather our physical possessions and those external attachments should not be what defines us. Imagine what your life would look like if you lived without being attached. Think of an attachment that enslaves you. Might be this, might be something else. Everyone knows what their personal attachments, Egypt's are. And now as we get ready for Pesach, and especially on Pesach itself, when our diet consists of matzah, it's the foundation of who we are. On Pesach, we establish our freedom from our attachments, from our dependencies. We're declaring independence from everything except for our core self, our essential self. And that's what the matzah, so to say, illustrates. It's demonstrating, it's personifying. So does this mean that we have to first break free from all our internal enslavements, whatever that takes, before we can experience freedom? Do we have to go through years of therapy to rid ourselves of all those attachments, of all the baggage, before we could actually reach true freedom? And think about it. If this were true, I don't know if anyone could ever experience true freedom. Because is it even possible to truly rid ourselves from all those elements? And if we even if you did manage, I think it could take a very long time. So should we just give up? And of course not. Don't despair. That would be very depressing. What we have to do, and I'm going to go back to the words of the Maharal for a moment. He says, no matter what we perceive as our attachments, they exist on a relatively superficial level. At our core, our attachments don't exist. In the deepest part of our soul, we are actually free. And that's something we have to realize. And that was the spiritual effect of God taking us out of Egypt. To realize that deep down, we're truly free. There's nothing that could interfere with that true freedom. So, that's the point of today's shiur. Let me just see if I have any other ideas that I wanted to remember. At our core, we're all truly free. Any questions?
Rabbi, just a few days ago in France, it was suggested there was an attacker out for the Jews.
Yeah.
And it was suggested maybe they shouldn't wear the kippah until things calm down. That takes away our freedom completely.
Absolutely.
Will we ever be free until the Mashiach comes?
Well, as life is in the world, I don't know if we Jews are the only ones who have persecution and oppression. And we have to stand up for our rights, and we have to stand up for to be proud of who we are. Okay, we have to just be proud. And let me, in fact, read to you a quick insight from the Rebbe, that maybe can answer your question that I happen to have in front of me. He says, a tree needs water, air, sunlight, and strong and deep roots implanted into the ground in order to be healthy and withstand any strong winds or harsh weather conditions. If a tree has all those needs fulfilled, then the tree is free from any problems. An animal, on the other hand, needs to be mobile. It must be able to roam around, to search for food, to be able to move from one place to another. If an animal has food and water, but is constricted to one spot like a tree, then it would have tremendous anguish and distress. It wouldn't be free at all. By denying it the most essential expression of its character, the ability to run wild, it is, in a sense, imprisoned. A human being who is an intellectual creature, even if he has the freedom to move around at will, but is prevented from using his intellect, then he's really not free at all. By denying him the most essential expression of character, his intelligence, he's being deprived of his true freedom. I think of those words as you ask your question, your point, Leonie. Freedom comes from really knowing who we are, knowing what defines us, and being able to express that freedom. So, yeah, the cloud is free only to go with the wind. The rain is free only if it's falling. That's not my words. That's famous words of a poet, right? We are free when we're true to ourselves. So if now I have to hide my yarmulke, am I really free? Right? And I think it's a question that, that's the point. We have to identify what makes us free. If anything is getting in the way of that, then we have to deal with it. So we have to know what makes us truly free. To go back to his words, the Rebbe's words, he says, true freedom for a Jew is to allow the expression of his or her most essential character, of the neshama. So there's a very famous Mishnah, in fact, that tells us, I think it's in Pirkei Avos we study this, which tells us that there's no true free person but one who's able to study Torah. What do you mean? If I'm confined to a book, to laws and regulations, that makes me free?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. That is what makes me free. That's the true freedom.
Okay. I'm free.
Yes. That's our identity. And so it's the makeup of our soul. It's the part of us that we get to express who we are. And so, yes, it's a journey to freedom. And the matzah personifies that because it shows us going back to our core of who we are, free to be you. And that's the question. What's your core? For a Jew, the core is to be able to express and practice their Judaism, to be able to fulfill the commandments of God.
Yeah.
Now, I know it doesn't sound like that's free. Maybe we could spend a few minutes just to talk about that, because there's two types of servitude. There's servitude that prevents us from being ourselves, and then there's a servitude that enables us to be ourselves, a servitude that enables us to attain positive freedom that we discussed. And sometimes subjecting ourselves to a specific guidelines and rules in our lives allows us to live a more focused and purposeful life. How does the saying go? He who is enslaved by the compass has the freedom of the seas. So let me ask you, who's freer? A couch potato who's sitting around all day watching TV, doing nothing, playing video games? Or someone, I don't know, a medical student who's constantly cramming in for the next exam, enslaved by laboratories and tests and deadlines? You tell me who's freer. You might say, well, the couch potato could do what he wants. Yeah, I know the medical student has all those restrictions and rules and all everything it takes to be a student. But that's the one who's actualizing their potential. That's the one who's really doing what they want to do.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? Here's a more abstract example. Is a painter without a canvas more free? Painter needs a canvas in order to express their talents, to illustrate, to paint. Now, of course, you might say that without the canvas, the painter has unlimited borders. But the canvas itself gives the painter the possibility to create those ideas. Okay, so similarly, for us, the Torah is not a rule book that's full of laws that we have to follow. It's God's guidebook. It's an instruction manual for life, a life of purpose, a life of meaning. It's a life in sync with our deepest desire, that's a relationship with God. A mitzvah is not something we check off from a to-do list. It's a channel through which we access our essence, our soul. So therefore, maybe you want to say Judaism is not a religion, because if religion is defined as a set of rigid rules that you have to follow, that's not Judaism.
Yeah.
If a person does a mitzvah because they're religious, then you miss the point. Judaism is not an agenda imposed on us. It's the very core of our soul's DNA. So I'll conclude with this line. You know, when Moshe approached Pharaoh and asked him to let the Jewish people go, what did he say to Pharaoh? Anyone know?
He said no.
No, what did Moshe say to Pharaoh before Pharaoh answered no?
Oh.
Let my people go, right?
Yes, let my people go.
No,
Yes.
but it didn't end there. What did he say? He said, let my people go so that they may serve me. Those were the words.
Yes.
Exactly. So Moshe didn't give the human rights argument to Pharaoh, let my people go because that's the right thing to do, because they're entitled to freedom. It's unjust to enslave them. He said, let my people go so that they may serve God. Okay?
Yes.
The Jewish people, freedom from slavery was just the freedom from. There was a freedom to, and that was already at the very beginning. That was the point. So that was the idea, the freedom to serve, to worship God. The purpose of the Jews' freedom is a relationship with Hashem. That was the point. Now, of course, through prayer, through understanding God, through acts of kindness, through doing mitzvahs, we're acting as our truest selves, the part of us that is godly, that's unlimited, that's unbounded, and that's truly free. And with that, we could reach our deepest potential, and that is freedom in its truest sense.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
All right, ladies and gents, thank you.
Yes.
Sei gesund. And
Thank you.
I didn't feel fully. Well, please God, tomorrow we'll do something else interesting. I think I'll go into the history of matzahs tomorrow. Looking forward to that. Okay.
Very interesting. Thank you.
All the